good morning, Kim. You have worked for a few decades now at the intersection of value assessment and balancing the interest and needs of trade groups and consulting groups where you've typically been based, as well as the absolute needs of payers intersecting with industry. A recent JMCP study was released that indicated that despite the fact that oncology drugs are costing so much more, and we have such a greater amount of competition, as well as other value assessment tools. Nevertheless, payers are not really availing themselves or managing that arena. What is really going on with tools that are used for value assessment, and why are they not more impactful, such as ICER's approach and the other methods that we have available to us?
That's a great question, Patty. And let me start by saying that I am absolutely tickled, to use one of my grandmother's favorite words. I'm tickled to be here as one of Patty's people, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today. As you mentioned, I have been engaged with ICER since it was founded in 2006. It's one of the most well-known value assessment resources here in the United States. And one of the questions that I get the most often is, how impactful are ICER's value assessments for US payer decision making? And the answer to that is they are impactful, but they're not as impactful as we're typically led to believe. So I'll give you a little bit of information first to share how they're used and their impact, but then to put it in the broader context of the other value assessment sources of information that are out there. As you mentioned, there's all sorts of other tools. And then to also put it into context for how few decisions ICER information is actually available for. So Syncora has a managed care network panel. It's a panel of US payers. And we've been talking to them about value assessment information and value assessment tools since 2016, which is really when value assessment frameworks, as we like to call them, started to come onto the scene here in the US, as we were shifting from volume-based purchasing to value-based purchasing. So what did these folks tell us? They told us, with respect to familiarity and use, and with ICER in particular, familiarity with ICER has been steadily increasing since 2016. Use, however, it increased from 2016 to 2018, and then it's really stabilized, leveled off. So what we've seen in this survey, 8 out of 10 respondents, US payers, tell us that yes, they do use ICER's value assessment information to help inform coverage and reimbursement decisions. Similar numbers, 8 and 10, say they use it to inform pricing negotiations. So they are using them. That's point number one. But point number two, to put it in the context of the whole universe of value assessment information that's available, they're just one of many, many sources, as you indicated. There are a lot of sources out there. In our survey, payers said the most valuable source of information for them is specialty society guidelines. Other sources of information that are of use sometimes: international health technology assessment information from PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, AMCP dossiers. So ICER information is just one small piece in the entire universe. That's point number two. Point number three, how many of the decisions that payers are making is that information from ICER really available for? And the answer is actually very small. ICER has limited resources, and they only do about 8 to 10 value assessment reports each year. So if you think about the universe of decisions that payers are thinking about, ICER rarely does a value assessment for something that's not a pharmaceutical. And even in the world of pharmaceuticals, if you think about the numbers, FDA approves about 50 new drugs each year. At the most, ICER's only looking at 10 of them. So that was a lot of information. To recap, payers are using ICER value assessment information to help inform their coverage and reimbursement decisions, to help inform their pricing negotiations. But it's only one piece of a much broader set of information that payers consider, and it's rarely available for most of the decisions that payers are thinking about.
Great summary. So I'm intrigued when you say they use it to inform. Is there an example where it is more impactful within the construct of all the different tools that they have available? And when they say inform, are there aspects of the framework that they put more credence in or less credence?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did some informational interviews with this same panel earlier this year and shared this information at AMCP. And when we talked with folks in the information interviews, you can delve a little bit more deeply, explore the nuance. And in those two types of decision contexts that I mentioned, coverage and reimbursement, price negotiations, what we consistently heard is if there is a value-based price available from ICER, it's going to be used in price negotiations. That's really the sweet spot for payers, is having a leverage point for those negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
So you asked about parts of the framework that might be more or less valuable, more or less interesting, helpful. ICER recently released its new updated framework. Periodically, it updates the framework throughout the years, and we just saw the new framework drop. So this was really potentially an exciting world for those of us in the value assessment space. There were some broad stakeholder consensus on what we would hope to see. And the bottom line is ICER really didn't make some substantive changes to the framework. It's pretty similar to what we've seen. So let me tell you a little bit about changes we saw, changes we didn't see. Process, I think, is interesting. Not many people are talking about the process, and then give you an idea of where ICER might head into the future. So first, changes we didn't see. I mentioned there's cross-stakeholder consensus on some changes like elevating the societal perspective. The societal perspective tends to take a broader view. It's more patient-centered, and we didn't see that elevation of the societal perspective over what ICER uses as its base case perspective, which is the health plan perspective. Similarly, we didn't see a broadening of patient-centered factors like caregiver burden in a quantitative way. Changes that we did see some important nods to health equity, to patient engagement, and that's really encouraging. Those are important areas of conversation in the value assessment space. The Innovation and Value Initiative is doing a lot in both of those areas. What remains to be seen for me is really how all of this unfolds. Historically, we've tended to see the focus on equity and patient engagement unfold as part of the qualitative narrative, really the value story in ICER's value assessment, which is important, but we haven't seen as much of an impact in terms of the results, the quantitative answer that we see. So that's what I'll be looking for is, do we really see a meaningful change as a result of these nods to equity and patient engagement?
What specifically would you like to see in terms of equity outcomes and equity assessment?
I would like to see more than lip service to equity. What we've seen, well, let me take a step back. Let me focus on one of the nods that we've seen here, which I think is important. ICER has an independent value assessment committee that votes on questions related to value. And historically, there has been a vote about impact of equity of whatever the treatment is that's under consideration. And under the old value assessment framework, we saw some confounding of what it might mean to have an impact on equity. So what does that mean, confounding? There were two ways to really think about equity, the way that the committees were voting on it. One way was thinking about, is this a treatment that could help an underserved population. And in that sense, you might look at a vote and say, oh, this is a positive step for equity. Providing access to this treatment helps the underserved population. Where that was getting confounded was with the idea of affordability, and will this underserved population that needs this treatment be able to access and afford the treatment? And what we were seeing in the votes under the old framework was those two tended to be at odds with each other, and you ended up seeing the votes just landing in the middle, like not a positive impact, not a negative impact. And you could kind of infer from the discussion that those were washing each other out. What's happening under the new framework is the equity questions are split into two pieces so that you can really look at the clinical impact that might happen in an equity sense, and are there going to be problems with access, and separate those two. And I think that's a really positive step.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly incremental improvements are welcomed, but honestly, if ICER is never going to adopt a societal viewpoint and their focus is private payers, is equity ever going to really be a conversation that they're willing to have?
We shall see. I'm encouraged by groups like the Innovation and Value Initiative that are really making some important steps in the equity space and pushing that conversation to front and center. And I am hopeful that we will see some movement in the equity space in the future. One thing that I really do want to call out in ICER's framework is process. And again, I don't think a lot of people are focused on process. I'm a process geek. I like things like this. And if we look at the process for this update to the framework with the most recent update, which was the 2020 update, there's some real noteworthy changes. And I have concerns about transparency and stakeholder engagement.
Okay.
So in 2020, the 2020 update, we saw a very transparent process laid out. This is when the open input period is going to be. This is when ICER is going to listen to that. This is when the comment period will be. Very clear. We knew what to expect, when to expect it. There were two opportunities for stakeholders to engage. And together, those two opportunities represented almost 100 days. Lots of time for input and lots of time for ICER to process that input and think about how it wanted to incorporate it in the updated stakeholder framework. What we didn't see this time was transparency around the process. There was some indication it might happen in June, might happen in July, it might not happen till 2024. It dropped suddenly at the beginning of June with a 25-day comment period, which is much shorter than the 100 days that we had in 2020. And if you take off weekends and holidays and summer vacations, it was very short. And what did we see? Did it matter? I think it really did matter. In 2020, more than 60 unique stakeholder groups commented on ICER's framework. This year, we had half of that commenting. And where we saw the biggest drop off was in patient groups. More than 20 patient groups commented in 2020. Eight commented this time, which is not a robust start for a meaningful patient engagement program, which is one of the areas that ICER is really elevating and saying is of importance to it. And why does that matter? Why am I focusing so much on process, some of this diminished transparency, diminished opportunity for stakeholder engagement? This is why I think it matters so much. When we look to the future, where is ICER headed with its framework? We saw a couple of placeholders in this current framework for future changes that ICER might want to make. Two examples are dynamic pricing, the idea that a price of a product changes over its life cycle. For example, when generics are introduced and we see a dropping of the price, that could be a dynamic price, changes in price. The second area that ICER flagged for potential change is a lowering of its cost effectiveness thresholds. And that's something that is opposed by a broad range of stakeholders. Now, both of these changes are things that would quantitatively impact ICER's assessment results. I talked earlier about changes that affected the qualitative narrative, and that isn't as impactful as changes that affect the quantitative results. What is the value-based price? That's the quantitative result that most payers are using in their price negotiation. So I get concerned when I see markers for future changes that could have a big impact on the quantitative result, intermingled with decreased transparency, decreased opportunity for stakeholder engagement. So that's one of the things that I'm really watching for when it comes to ICER's changes with its framework.
What other stakeholder groups do you think are not being considered or are not having an opportunity to comment? Any other voices that we are really missing in this discussion?
You know, from a transparency perspective, the voices that we don't see, but I do believe they're having an opportunity to comment, are payers. You know, it's funny, if you look at stakeholder comments, another thing that ICER does very well is to put out the stakeholder comments that it receives. In the past, stakeholder engagement and transparency have been so important to ICER, that sort of the hallmarks on which it builds its credibility, which is why I'm calling them out. I'd like to see them move back in that direction. If you look again at the stakeholder comments that were received for this particular framework, those 32 comments that were received, you see patient groups, you see manufacturers, you see some researchers, academics, trade associations. There's actually no payer comments on the framework. Now, payers are ICER's primary audience. I'm sure that ICER is talking with payers. I'm sure that ICER is tailoring its output and its information to meet the needs of payers, but we're not seeing that transparency and visibility around what payers want from ICER's framework in the public sphere.
So let's talk a little bit about some of the cell and gene therapy value analysis. You just published a new analysis that explores ICER's adaptations for valuing potential cures on the high-impact single and short-term therapies. What have you learned through this analysis?
Oh, thank you for bringing that up. This was a really exciting analysis to do. So gene therapies are potentially transformative, right? One administration potentially bringing a lifetime of value, cure to patients, diseases that we previously thought were incurable. Really, really exciting. But it introduces some real challenges to value assessment. Two of those challenges are timing and uncertainty. So if you think about timing, value at its core is benefits and cost. What are the benefits you get? What do you have to pay to get those benefits? You can define them differently, but those are the two components of value, benefits and cost. From a timing perspective, in our present healthcare system, which is a real mess here in the US, we have a lot of crazy incentives, a lot of issues with our system. From a cost perspective, you may be paying one time upfront for benefits that last a lifetime. So you've got a mismatch in timing under our current payment system. And then uncertainty is related to that. Are these benefits going to last a lifetime? What is the durability of effect? We are asking payers to pay for these products. What are they paying for? What is the value? We hope that there is going to be a cure. We hope that there's a lifetime impact, but we don't always know. Even the best clinical trials are not going to give you answers to what is that lifetime impact going to look like. So to ICER's credit, it recognizes that the value assessment needs for cell and gene therapies are different. It has been doing a lot of cell and gene therapy assessments over the past year. This is a very important area for payers to get information in. And what do we see when we look at how ICER is applying its methods? It developed methods specifically for what they call SSTs, single and short-term transformative therapies, back in 2017. We're seeing those methods being applied as it's doing these new reviews of cell and gene therapies. And we saw a couple of concerns in our analysis with respect to methods and limitations. And I'll just give you an example of one of each of those. So in regards to methods, ICER invented what it calls shared savings approach. And on the surface, it sounds very magnanimous. These treatments are going to provide benefits, value, and we're going to share that savings, the benefits, the value with society. That sounds great. It sounds great. But what is it really? What it really is it's essentially a cap of the benefits that the treatment can realize or recognize in the context of ICER's analysis. Is that problematic? So you can look at it in two ways. On the one hand, it's a great conversation to have, right? How much benefit should the treatment be recognizing? However, this approach isn't evidence-based. It's something that ICER made up, and it's something that is opposed by a wide range of stakeholders. So methodologically, there's some concerns there. And then when we shift to application and still looking at the same approach, the shared savings approach, there's some concerns here too. As I mentioned, it's not a bad conversation to have. When ICER introduced this concept, it introduced it using the word exploratory. This is just designed to spark some conversation, to have some discussions, which is a fair thing to do. We have questions around durability of effect. ICER said it won't use the shared savings approach to set its value-based price. And then what happened? In December of last year, ICER silently, without announcing it, without having an opportunity for stakeholder engagement, changed its framework. It just posted a new framework on the website, wasn't announced, and the framework codified the shared savings approach, which means it was no longer exploratory. It was no longer designed just to spur conversations and consider it. It was now going to be a potential driver of ICER's value-based price. And that's what we saw. We saw it start to show up in the press release, in the what ICER calls its report at a glance, which is often the only thing that people look at to get the highlights of a report that might be over 100 pages long. And that concerns me. So we've got the methodology that isn't evidence-based, that's opposed by stakeholders, and we've got the application happening in a way that is inconsistent with the original intent and changed without transparency, without stakeholder engagement. And I do want to be clear, there are good people at ICER. I believe they want to do the right thing. I believe they want transparency. I believe that they want stakeholder engagement. And I am hopeful that when Dan Ohlendorf comes back in November as chief science officer, Sarah Iman takes over as the incoming president, that these are things that they will elevate and that they'll really be focusing on bringing that transparency back, elevating the opportunities for stakeholder engagement, because again, those are the principles that ICER was built on and embraced so holistically for many years.
Are there any unintended or intended consequences with this codification that may occur before the new leadership at ICER has the opportunity to reconsider this approach?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So the biggest unintended consequences is the way that this works and pulls through in the results is it's essentially capping the price. So it's moving towards a lower price. And it appears to be more consistent with cost minimization, moving towards a low price than what is a value-based price. If ICER does its typical cost effectiveness analysis, which it does, you get a much higher price in the millions of dollars. That is technically cost effective. And what's happening is this price is being artificially lowered, again, with a methodology that is not evidence-based. It's something that ICER created. And that sends signals on innovation. That sends signals on what value looks like and what we're willing to pay for in our health system, and that has ripple effects. So that's what I'm concerned about, the innovation signals, patients being able to get these transformative therapies. We've always seen in the news lately new products that were in development for maybe an ultra rare population, and the incentives just weren't in place to continue developing that product. That's what I worry about.
The 1980s called and cost minimization methodology wants to go back under the ground.
Yes, yes.
So, Kim, what has been in the news so much, of course, for the last 6 to 8 months is the CMS ruling for the Inflation Reduction Act. How is some of the work that ICER is doing informing or influence the CMS approach and vice versa?
Yeah, so I'm getting a lot of questions about this lately. And first, let me provide a little bit of context for anybody watching that isn't as familiar with Medicare drug price negotiation. So the Inflation Reduction Act gives CMS the power to set maximum fair prices for, at this point in time, 10 drugs. And we know a whole list of factors that CMS will consider, and Peter Newman went through them in the excellent interview you did with him about a month ago. What are those factors? Some of them are therapeutic advantage, unmet need, clinical effectiveness. What we don't know is how CMS will weight these factors to ultimately get to what it's going to call a maximum fair price. And it could be weighting these factors and considering them in a value-based way, or it could be looking at them in a cost minimization way. So lots of conversations about how this could happen, how this should happen. And ICER, of course, wants to be relevant in this conversation. I mean, this is their bread and butter, setting value-based prices, looking at the evidence, thinking about what a value-based price might look like. So ICER recently released a report where they looked at 2 of the products that are currently on that list for Medicare drug price negotiation, Eliquis and Xarelto. And the questions I'm getting the most often is, what does CMS do with this report? What might they do? So what do we see in this report? We see some familiar things, some new framing for ICER, and then we see something that's really hard to interpret. So the familiar things, we see a very familiar structure to what an ICER value assessment report would typically look like. There's comparative and cost effectiveness. There is a qualitative narrative around patient-centered factors. Familiar structure. There's a little bit of new framing. The new framing, and this isn't completely new, but ICER tends to focus on what is known as the quality adjusted life year, the QALY, in its cost effectiveness framing. And CMS is banned from using the QALY in Medicare drug price negotiations because here in the US, as Dan Ohlendorf likes to say, the QALY is everyone's favorite punching bag. There are many stakeholders that believe that the QALY is discriminatory because it looks at 1 year of life in perfect health. So anyone who is not in perfect health could be, as the punching bag narrative goes, could be discriminated against. Mm-hmm. ICER has another metric that it uses in its value assessment, and this metric is called the equal value life year. And both of these metrics are in ICER's reports. What has shifted in the framing for the CMS assessment, and this is also new framing in ICER's updated value assessment framework, is that the equal value life year is now front and center. So while reports have historically included both, and going forward, they'll continue to use both, the EVLEG, equal value life year gained, EVLEG is its acronym nickname, is front and center in the CMS report, and it will be front and center moving forward in the value assessment framework, which I think is part of ICER's nod to be relevant for CMS's activities.
Mhm.
So that's what's familiar. That's the new framing. The part that's hard to interpret. So ICER's reports typically include a value-based price estimate.
Mhm.
Payers know what to do with this. They use it as a leverage point in their price negotiation process. This report for CMS, the special assessment, does not include a value-based price estimate. It includes a price premium. And everyone's like, what do we do with this price premium?
Mhm.
So first, why do we have a price premium? We have a price premium because ICER does not have all of the information in order to calculate a relevant value-based price for CMS. We know list prices for products. What we don't know is the net price that CMS is paying. And this is, of course, the price after rebates, discounts are taken out, all of those strange incentives that we've got in our healthcare system. So we don't know the net price that CMS is paying. CMS knows this information. So what did ICER do? ICER said, what are some reasonable therapeutic alternatives? And they selected two representative therapeutic alternatives, warfarin and dabigatran. And we don't know which one CMS will select, if they'll select those, if they'll select others. So ICER selected those and estimated price premiums for Eliquis and Xarelto that are relative to those two therapeutic alternatives. So what do you do with this? If you're CMS, you're looking at warfarin, you look at the price premium for Eliquis relative to warfarin. Your CMS, you have a net price estimate. You can add the price premium to that net price that you, CMS, know and come up with a representative value-based price based on ICER's view of the factors, the cost effectiveness, et cetera. So that was pretty complicated. So a couple things I want to add there. First, the therapeutic alternative matters. If you look at the numbers in ICER's report, you see different price premiums depending on what it's being compared to, depending on the product that we're looking at. So what CMS selects for its therapeutic alternative is really going to drive this. The other thing I want to emphasize, and this is based on my understanding of ICER's intent, is that even once you have the information to back out that value-based price, that value-based price is not intended to represent a maximum fair price or a price ceiling. It is only intended to be an example of what a value-based price might look like. So where does this leave us? Back to the question, what does CMS do with this? So time will tell what CMS does with this. And will CMS use this information to help estimate a value-based price, or is CMS really driving towards cost minimization? And this matters because of the incentives we have in our system, what those signals will do for future innovation. When we aren't making value-based purchasing decisions, then we're not incentivizing value-based innovation and development decisions.
If we're 5 years down the road with these different factions assessing value, how's it going to sort out? What do you think is going to be included and kept, and what do you think is going to be jettisoned because they work at cross purposes, or they're not fully transparent, or they're simply just not useful?
That's a great question. I wish I knew the answers to that. One thing that I really hope to see is I hope to see some of the most glaring misaligned incentives that are in the Inflation Reduction Act to be fixed. Right now we've got an issue with orphan disease and rare indication, and we've got an incentive in place that is going to discourage people from follow-on indications. It might interfere with the sequencing of what indication does a manufacturer develop first. That's a real area of need for patients. That's where we're most at risk of seeing things falling off in terms of the innovation and development. And that's one area where I hope we can look back in 5 years and say, oh, we fixed that misaligned incentive. I also hope that we look back and see that CMS is focusing on value-based considerations, not what were the research and development costs? I mean, that sounds like such a logical thing to look at, but it's really not. You can't just say this was the research and development cost for this particular product. Manufacturers are developing so many products in a portfolio, and so many of them are failures. They never make it to market. And the research and development costs that go into all of those failures, which are not failures per se, they're failures in that they don't get to the market, but they all provide information that can help us make future innovations and developments. The cost to invest in all of that research and development goes into a single product's research and development. And it's very hard to provide a meaningful R&D estimate.
So, Kim, there's been a lot of discussion of whether or not this foray of CMS into value assessment is perhaps them appearing to take on the role of a national HTA body. Could you please comment on that? What would be the value, the benefits, the concerns, the consequences?
Yeah, great question. So we've actually been having conversations here in the US about a potential national value assessment body. It's called a health technology assessment body in other countries for years. This isn't a new conversation, but it's been elevated in recent months with CMS, not just Medicare drug price negotiation, but really with coverage with evidence development that we're seeing in the Alzheimer's space. And CMS really isn't equipped to be a national value assessment body. One of the things that we did with the survey this year, where we go to US payers and ask them about their opinions on value assessment, we asked them about their appetite for a national value assessment body. And what we heard back was pretty interesting, I think. So it was a multi-response question. So these things are not mutually exclusive. But first we asked them, should we have a value assessment body? And 70% of US payers responding to our survey said, yes, we should have a national value assessment body. 15% said no, we shouldn't, and 15% weren't sure. So that's the first thing. Payers are interested in having a national value assessment body. We also asked them about funding, and about half of them preferred a government funding body. 40%, 4 out of 10, said they would prefer a mix of government and private funding. That way, it's not beholden to either one. But here's the thing I think is the most interesting question, and this is the question that was the multi-response question. We asked payers about the purpose for this body that they're interested in, because I think where our mind immediately goes is that this is a body that's going to conduct value assessment. The vast majority said that the most important purpose, this is 85% of our respondents, the most important purpose for a national US value assessment body would be developing standards for value assessment in the US. What does good practice look like? That was followed by an interest in evaluating the value assessments conducted by others. So the quality of a value assessment conducted by ICER, let's say. 70% of payers were interested in that. And then 6 out of 10 were interested in this national value assessment body conducting its own value assessment. So this is pretty interesting, because the most important thing that payers wanted was a sense of, what does good look like? What are the standards for good? What other people like ICER are doing, is that good? That's really what payers are looking at. I do think that while payers have interest in a national value assessment body, the US is not ready for a prescriptive value assessment body. We have a complicated, decentralized system. We like to have more information, but we don't like to be told what to do with that information.
On the managed care network, have you asked that question before, or is this the first time?
This is the first time, yes. And you know what, Patti? I haven't shared this information with anyone before.
So, Kim, you've been working in this field for a few decades, and as you think back on the training that you received and the training of your colleagues, for our universities that are educating graduate students, what should they be doing differently to launch researchers that have the full construct of capabilities to function within this really innovative value assessment world that we're in now?
Yeah, I'm going to shift gears on you here, Patti. It's a great question. And, I'm an economist. I can think about the types of tools that we need to do value assessment. And really, what I want to think about here is stepping back. I do this during the week, value assessment, economics, but on the weekend, I'm a yoga teacher. I'm a life coach. And my purpose in life is helping people thrive in their own lives. And so when I think about the tools that we all need, one of the biggest barriers to thriving in our lives is the way that we approach mental health. And I think that everyone could benefit from getting more training, more tools in recognizing when people are struggling with mental health, when figuring out how to connect with people, how to get them resources and tools. If we could all do that, we all got more training in that, either through our formal curriculums or just in the course of our day-to-day lives, our world would be a better place.
Kim, often when I have the opportunity to sit down with leaders like you in the field, I'm always interested in what they're thinking about and talking about that none of us are discussing. What's the best thing in healthcare that no one is talking about and that we should be discussing?
I just told you I was going to shift gears for our last question. Now I'm really going to shift gears on you. The best thing in healthcare that no one else is talking about is a movement called healthy deviance. This is the book so that you can see what I'm saying, because I'm sure it's like, what is that word that you just said? Yes, I said the word deviant, which is caught by all of our spam filters. What is healthy deviance? Healthy deviance is a movement that was created by Pilar Gerasimo, and it's about really examining what we are defining as health in our world today. It's thinking about, what do we value? What are the incentives that are in place in our world? If you think about calling out the crazy with misaligned incentives, one that we've been talking about today is net prices related to PBMs, rebates, coupons. This puts all sorts of crazy incentives into our world. We're not paying for biosimilars because it actually is more valuable for a PBM to go with the branded product. In our personal lives, when I was growing up, I used to read magazines that said things like 83 moves to a bikini ready body. Nobody needs that, right? I don't need a bikini ready body. I need a body that is strong and can support my activities of daily living. Healthy deviance is about calling out that crazy, renegotiating reality. And if we could merge the healthy deviant movement with aligned values, aligned incentives. We've been talking a lot about values and incentives today. If we could bring all of that together, my professional life, my personal life, bringing all of those things together, then our healthcare system would be better off. Our collective health and wellness would be better off. And Patti Peeples, that is the world that I want to live in 5 years from now.
Save me a spot at the table.
Will do.
Well, Kim, thank you so much. This was a really great conversation.
Thank you. I value and appreciate the opportunity so much.